What if you could give advice to your younger self? What if your advice could alter the path of your aging? What advice would you give? Would you give advice to your younger self? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we reflect on the podcast journey through the lens of well-centered fitness, or the SPIES model, discuss the lessons learned and advice we would or would not give our younger selves. We explore themes of spiritual growth, importance of experience, physical well-being, intellectual growth, emotional resilience, and the significance of social connections in aging well. The conversation emphasizes the value of grace, lifelong learning, and the impact of community on personal development and aging well.
Wow, can you believe that we started this podcast journey not too long ago, and it has been quite an adventure, I would say. And we've had some amazing guests that I've learned so much, and I believe that you've learned a lot also. And honestly, we've done a lot of personal growing in our own life as we've taken on this adventure, and we're promoting aging well. And it's if we're going to promote it, we're going to walk that same route. And I just thought on today's episode, what if we could go back in time? What if we could speak to our younger selves and give them advice? What advice would we give them if all the stuff that we've learned on this podcast, we could tell them back then? What do you think about that?
You kind of know how I feel about, going back in time and changing anything. I'm not a big fan of the whole idea. But you've talked about me being asked the question before about if you can go back in time and change anything, what would you change? And for me, if I'd go back in time and give advice to myself, who would I be today without learning that advice along the way? So maybe we can reframe that question a little bit and just talk about, in a way, what have we learned that maybe we wish we had learned sooner, or something from kind of that perspective.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I'd like to start with the SPIES approach, but I also
Okay.
recognize that when we're talking to our younger selves, we should note that what age bracket and what advice we're providing to. Does that make sense? So the advice that we're giving to our 6-year-old self is going to be way different than our 26-year-old self, or even our 46-year-old self. And I think it would be a good way to discuss what we've learned and what could have impacted us back then at that time. Now, Dr. Armstrong, I know that you never want to go back and change your life, but surely there has been some life lessons that you grew from and then that you would love to learn to spread that wisdom. I mean, surely there was some part of you that as you were walking down the road of life, you were like, man, I wish I knew a little bit more of this information. And if so, using SPIES would be a really cool thing to discuss what you've learned. So let's dive into it. Spiritually, what would you tell your younger self?
Like I said, I wouldn't tell my younger self anything, because I think my younger self needs to learn the lessons that I've learned over my life. And so, from the standpoint of spiritual, I wouldn't change a thing. I mean, I've gone through and continue to go through significant spiritual growth that if I went back and changed at any earlier point in time, I'm going to miss out on a lesson that I needed to learn at that time. And so from a spiritual standpoint, I think it's important for us to understand that life deals us lessons that shape who we become. And if we don't experience those, we don't become the same person we are at this moment. And so if I was going to go back in time and intervene with myself in my life, is just like, just ride the wave, just experience what you're going to experience and don't fear what lies ahead, because it's there for purpose. What about yourself?
Well, for me, if I could go back in time and I could talk to my younger self, I would just say that um, I'm not alone, and that there is a spirit realm, and that the spirit realm is very real, and that I don't have to do stuff on my own will or my own um, grit, I guess you could say, and that I can put my faith into a God that is there for me. And that's what I would say to my younger self. And having that relationship will definitely help you, my younger self, overcome a lot of things. It'll pull me out of things that I couldn't even comprehend at that time. So that would be the advice that I would give my younger self.
Do you think that getting that advice would make your life any different at this point in time?
At this point in time, no, because I comprehend now that I've come pretty far with my spiritual journey, and I understand it a little bit more. When I was younger, I didn't quite understand. I didn't have that grasp. I didn't have that relationship, and I struggled. I really, really struggled. I hit a level of dark depression, and anxiety, and just a lot. I hated myself, to be honest. Man, we're getting really vulnerable in this episode. And just to let myself know that, hey, I don't have to feel that way. And there's a God that loves me, and that he, like, you build that relationship, it's gonna be great. It's gonna be good. And you just gotta have a little bit more understanding of who that God is. And and it's it's gonna be a literally life changing. So
If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast. But my question is, do you think your path would be different? I mean, don't you think you needed to go through, I mean, we're talking about, spirituality and purpose, and that the experiences that we have in life are for our spiritual evolution, for that point of growing us. And if we don't experience those, we are not going to be the same person. It's like, lifting weights, it's like, you go through a trajectory, a pathway that, gets you stronger. And maybe, I mean, it's probably not the best analogy in there, but, that if there is a plan for us in our lives, if that, those of us that believe there is a plan, then that plan has to go through certain steps to get to where it will ultimately go. And if you take different steps, you end up in a different place. And, for those who are maybe not of a more religious twist, it's kind of the same thing. Our growth process requires that we go through very specific steps in order to get to where we are now. And anything that we do differently is ultimately going to change where we are today. You have every experience, every interaction that you have, good or bad, growing up is going to bring you to a certain place. And you change that anywhere along the way. To me, it changes not only you, and again, to go into the SPIES model and think of that there's something greater than self, our interactions with others likewise contribute to their pathway. And so it's not just about changing my direction or my path or decision that I made for my sake. It's for a much more universal sake, that if I change something that I did, if I interact differently, and I've had this conversation, we talking about Jay, my good friend Jay, who introduced us to the idea of calling this the SPIES model. Jay, there are certainly things that I would have done, and Jay's going to kick my butt for, bringing this up again because he keeps telling me to stop talking about it. But, I certainly should have treated Jay differently when we were younger. And, it's just the way it was. And if we did that any differently, things might not be the same for both of us. And so, it could be, but and not only, different between the two of us, but how he's interacted with people, how I treat people differently. There's a lot of things that I would go back and tell my younger self, dude, don't do that. That's not right. That's not kind. That's not nice. And it would be great to be able to go back and change all that. But what effect is that going to have universally? And it just, to me, it doesn't behoove us to go back and want to change things. It's okay. All those events have brought me to where I am now. Any interaction you and I have had over the course of the 10 plus years I've known you, same thing. It's can't do things differently. It is what it is, but how does that impact me now and the next step that I'm going to take in my life? And so when you bring up the question of what would you tell your younger self, it becomes a deeply, truly spiritual question, because what you tell yourself and how you have interacted with, now that you've interacted with yourself, or how you have interacted with others in the past, and changing that has tremendous spiritual implications, implications for changing anyone and everyone. Because if you think of the 6 degrees of separation, we are connected easily to more than 6 people in anything that we do. So one decision that I made back in, you talk about different stages of life, whether it's elementary school, middle school, high school, college, early career, late career, last week, yesterday, any of those decisions not only impact me, they're going to impact somebody else. And so to go back and change one thing, that could largely prevent somebody from becoming who they're supposed to become. I know that sounds overly deep, but that's why I stand on this idea of not going back in time and worrying about things. It's just how has my past led me to where I am today, and how do I seize this moment to better impact the universe going forward?
You don't think it would be really cool if your younger self knew or comprehended something that your older self now knows? Even though things had to happen, even though things impacted not only yourself but those around you and their lives and their growth, you don't think it would still be a really cool thing to have that little nugget of information, that little nugget of knowledge, to, as you're walking down the road of life and You just have this in your back pocket. You have a deeper understanding. So the trajectory has even more of an impactful event on yourself and those around you.
If I was intended to have that information at an earlier time, I would have had it. I don't believe that, I'm going to largely change the world by going back and changing one decision that I've made in the past for the better. I believe wholeheartedly that the path that we take is part of our development. And this is why, I've had questions in classes where we talk about, whether somebody can actually clone themselves. And, you get into that level of, the physical and the spiritual colliding. You cannot, in my opinion, clone an individual. You may be able to duplicate their DNA and develop somebody who is overall physiologically the same as them. But, we've talked about epigenetics and the impact that has on how our genes are turned on and turned off, which in a sense also is going to cause that even though we have the same starting DNA, you're not going to develop the same person. But that person is every experience that they have had in their lifespan. And so I have scars on my body that a clone of me would not have because they would not have that experience. Every event that occurred during my mom's roughly 9 months of pregnancy with me is going to impact me. That is not going to be the same impact that somebody has my same DNA now would have. Interactions with the people that we meet at the time that we meet them is going to have a different impact on us that's going to affect how well we age. So I think it's a profound question to ask, but if we're going to ask that question, we also have to say, well, what would be different if I went back and had this knowledge at this point? You know how much I would love to have some of the knowledge of physiology that I have now back in high school, from an athletic training standpoint. I would go back, looking at sport-wise, if I could go back in time to high school, I wouldn't have been worried about gaining weight for football. I would have focused on wrestling and kept my weight at a point where I didn't have to cut 30 pounds every year and then gain another 30 pounds back for football. My senior year, I wouldn't have started out the season saying, I want to wrestle at heavyweight. I'm going to go down to my normal weight and wrestle where I was supposed to. That would have had profound differences in terms of the outcomes of my college sports life. But to what end? I've learned lessons from all that I would not have learned. And so to presume that myself today could go back and know what myself 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago needed to know is a bit naive and I think a bit presumptuous. Does that make sense?
Yep. Well, that's going to eliminate my next question then. I don't mean to be presumptuous, but using the SPIES approach, segueing away from the spiritual and going into the physical, what would you tell your younger self? How would you tell them to age well in the physical, and why specifically would you give them that information that you know now versus past information that you may have held in your class on some of the lectures?
Again, it's a kind of odd question really to ask. I would love to have the knowledge of physiology in the 1970s that, I have now. I got introduced to weightlifting really through more Nautilus principles, through high intensity training. But looking back on that, it was like that was where I needed to be developmentally because it taught me much more about kinesiology than I think most students get in the kinesiology class, because I experienced how a muscle is supposed to contract, speed of movement, fatigue, all these different things. And in an environment that, as I had more tools in my tool belt, I was able to use much more effectively. I mean, I think back to going to Steel City Nautilus and Biz Stark, who was the owner, that he would get so frustrated with me. And I think of my friend Danny, who trained with me often too. And we both had a problem on this one machine called the hip and back, that our technique would get significantly flawed because we would want to keep adding weight to it. And Biz would try everything to get me to be doing that right. He would remind me that, the Miami Dolphins, who trained extensively at that time on Nautilus equipment, were not using as much weight as I was attempting to use. And that usually was a good trigger. Say, okay, when I get to that certain weight, then I'm progressing too fast. I'm not doing this right. But there was one day I was doing the machine wrong, and he came up and said, Jeff, if you're not going to do this machine correctly, I'm just going to, refund your money and send you on your way, because my business depends on results. And if you don't get results, my business suffers. And that was enough to just trigger me to do it right. And I got to the point where training on that equipment, training people on that equipment, I could be in the room, across the room, back to the machine, and I can tell that somebody was doing the machine wrong. I could pretty much, from any piece of equipment, tell somebody's doing it wrong just from the sound of them performing the movement. And Danny had a different experience with being corrected on that. In his case, Biz took a black Sharpie marker, and every time he did an incorrect repetition, he marked his leg. And Danny left that training session with just this huge black blob on his leg. And so that experience taught me a lot more, that really led me to having an interest in exercise physiology. Would it have been better for me to have learned about exercise physiology before I went to college and started in that, and got my degree in it as an undergrad? I don't know. My education would have been different. There are things that I wouldn't have learned because I would have had a different perspective. And I know we're getting away from the physical and getting back into the spiritual piece. But again, this whole question is always going to lead back to the spiritual understanding as you look at it. And this is where you see that interconnection between the spiritual, the physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. And so, there are tons of things that I wish I knew. I would love to have go back in time and take all the principles that we learned from John Frappier for Athletic Republic and create those for myself, But, would that benefit? I mean, it would benefit me, but it would have changed a lot of things in the universe. I wish I learned about the Zercher squat a lot earlier. I wish I learned that cardio was not, king, that strength training was the more important thing earlier on in my exercise physiology career. I wish I knew better about nutrition when I was younger. We didn't have the knowledge back in the 70s that we have now in terms of protein content, quality, those types of things. Creatine was unheard of. So I could go back in time and I could be like the king of exercise physiology because I have all this knowledge that I take back with me. But, I had to learn it, and it wasn't the time for that knowledge to be revealed to the universe. So what about yourself?
We'll take a quick pause to acknowledge the affiliate brands that help make this podcast possible. These aren't sponsors, and no one pays for placement. But when you use our affiliate links, it supports the mission of the Aging Well podcast. One partner I've chosen after careful vetting is Berkeley Life, known for their nitric oxide support products. I value their commitment to quality, testing, and education around vascular wellness, and I use their products myself. If you'd like to support the show and explore Berkeley Life for your own health journey, you'll find a link in the episode description.
Well, for me, most of it, a lot of it has to do with some of the awesome guests that we've had. And they would just be little tiny things that I would just give my younger self little nuggets, right? Things that I may have heard, but I didn't really comprehend. And I would just say, hey, prioritize gum health. We definitely have had some guests where they've talked about the importance of that. And obviously I've heard that when I was younger, but going into the details of gum health and how it really impacts the rest of the body. It's just a little tiny tweak, but something like that I could do in the physical, that would help me age well. Obviously, prioritizing sleep, just the importance of that. In my 20s, I was working 3 or 4 jobs, even when I was working for you at Athletic Republic. And unfortunately, I was not prioritizing sleep at all. I was averaging like 3 hours of sleep a night, and that was not good. And just making sleep a priority is definitely going to be something that I have adapted to, kind of adopted from hearing you with your bedtime. I have also adopted that routine, and it's helped dramatically. It's helped me in the physical, it's helped me in the mental. Prioritizing sleep has just been such a game changer. Pushing yourself to the limit with no sleep is a very juvenile thing I have learned in my in my walk of life. Another thing I would advise myself is just kind of, especially in my 20s, let's say, avoid alcohol. I mean, yeah, you can partake once in a while, but don't do it as much as I was. I don't know what I was doing. I was dumb and young. And yeah, you're right. It is part of life, and it's a life lesson. And I wouldn't be where I'm at today. But if I could just give myself a little nugget and say, hey, if you want to age well, pump the brakes a bit. That's one thing I would say. And then lastly, I would just say, I would just advise my younger self to not stop lifting heavy. Just continuously do it, no matter what's going on in my life. Just find a time to just lift heavy. And those are just the main things that I would do, to tell my younger self, hey, if you want to age well physically, just tweak these things, just tweak these lifestyle changes. I don't think it would really impact that much of those around me, but I definitely think it would significantly impact me to age well. That's my take on the physical.
So maybe rather than going back in time and trying to change ourselves, maybe we just present this as information that we would present to various ages relative to what we have learned, that somebody else can learn from this to age well.
Yeah.
Because again, I would tell, and I do tell my college students a lot more, you got to promote sleep more importantly, and sleep is critical, and trying to have that regularity of sleep is going to be hugely important. And my kids won't listen to me on that. And again, sometimes a lot of these lessons that we learn about aging well come from the wisdom that we gain from the mistakes that we make in our lives. And so,
right,
from a physical standpoint, I would say, okay, sleep, prioritize sleep, no matter what your age, have a bedtime, get up at the same time, be consistent, and not fall into that trap of, having late nights here and there because you're, going out drinking, partying with friends, or you're staying up watching movies or TV and those types of things. Realize that you can get a hold of that a lot earlier in life and not have to suddenly in your 50s, 60s or whatever say, okay, now I need to start sleeping better because it's not really good for my health. And I don't want to get dementia or, whatever other reasons that we might give for needing to sleep more regularly. So sleep, yes, I would say I would advise all individuals, every age, to look at their sleep hygiene and get into a pattern of sleeping regularly, sleeping well, and preparing themselves for sleep, and getting enough sleep on a regular basis. And then when it comes to exercise, then I would look at getting into resistance exercise as young as possible. I would still stand by what I would advise in terms of start off more with machines to get a sense for how the joint movements and how the muscles are supposed to contract. Learn those movements early on and begin to add in complexity as soon as possible, but do complexity without throwing a lot of weight on, not lifting too heavy, but, focus on technique first. And then once the technique is perfect, then you start adding resistance in perfect progression. You're always doing perfect form or near perfect form. As soon as we start doing too many reps or too much weight to where our form deviates from near perfect, the more likely we are to get hurt and to develop motor patterns that are going to be less advantageous to our overall development and growth. I would focus on cardiovascular, but not doing too much cardiovascular, unless, of course, my younger self wanted to get involved more with some distance running and things like that. But, have a good balanced approach to exercise, not do the same thing over and over again, recognize the importance of periodization and plyometrics, and focus on nutrition, understanding that all that, not eat the processed foods, not eat the chips, not drink the pop, not drink the alcohol, and, try and eat more fruits and vegetables, leaner meats, healthier fats, get my legumes, eat the things that I maybe didn't like as a child, eat those. And, those would be the types of things that I would want my younger self to have known. But I'm not going to go back and change any of that because I've learned my lessons.
Well, let's go into intellectual. Now, when I was writing this, I was kind of getting excited because I was assuming that as we dove into the subject of intellectual, you being a college professor, you would understand the importance of how it is critical to continuously allow your mind to grow as you're wanting to age well. And so I guess my question is, what would be some advice that you would give? Or perhaps has there been a guest that we've had on this podcast that has completely changed your perspective on the subject of intelligence?
The subject of intelligence? Not sure that we've had any guest that has really swayed my opinion on intelligence. And I don't know that I've had anybody anywhere in my life that has dramatically swayed my opinion on intelligence. And I guess it depends too on how you're defining intelligence. But, in terms of education, that's a different question. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's different types of intelligence, right? There's, linguistal, there's mathematical, there's spatial, there's kinematics, there's musical, there's interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, and there's just a whole bunch of different types of intelligence that are out there, social intelligence. And so
I think that's all for PhDs to be able to have. That's just a way for PhDs to have something to write about. I'm not a big fan of all these different intelligences. I think intellect is intellect, and I mean, you could say, you have your SPIES, intellectual quotient. Where are you in your SPIES quotient? And it's like, it's knowledge is knowledge. I think we need a balanced approach to understanding education and knowledge. And, you got to tie wisdom into intellect. It's not just about knowing things. It's about being able to apply things and to be able to generate new knowledge. So there's so much that goes into that. And there's not been anybody that has really swayed my opinion dramatically. Again, it goes back to just the evolution of my thought patterns and my knowledge and understanding and my interests. And I was hugely fortunate growing up to have phenomenal teachers and parents that really presented a much more balanced approach to understanding. One of my favorite stories to tell is, from growing up was I was one of two students from an elementary school that got a scholarship to Carnegie Museum for, I think it was a Tam O'Shanter art program. It was for, I forget what grade it started in, but, it met Saturday mornings. I think throughout the academic year, it was pretty regular, but it was early Saturday mornings to go, and you had it was like an hour, 2-hour art lesson. Just kids from all over the Pittsburgh area. And my dad would drop me off, and then he'd pick me up when it was done, and I would change into my football uniform in the Liberty Tunnels in Pittsburgh, changing in the car, driving to Little League football. And, I had that balance of that art, plus, the sports, but also, grades were a big focus. In 6th grade was in the high school musical because they needed kids for Oliver. And I'm not a musically inclined individual, but I got exposed to all this stuff, arts, sports, intellectual avenues, and had great teachers. I learned how to write. I learned math. I had just phenomenal teachers. And so I had a good foundation on which to build. And so I don't think anything has really evolved in terms of my thoughts on intellect or intelligence or, the intellectual dimension of spies. And the only thing that probably has shifted a little bit is, I have really come to be much more solidly footed on a more liberal education, where I think one thing that we are really, really missing in today's educational system is teaching the breadth of the intellects, as you might call them. It's like, and I love that my son is doing a arts and letters degree. A few years ago, I might have been a little bit more like, you're kidding me? I'm not paying for, an English education. You're not going to be able to get a job. But the more I thought about it, the more hireable he is going to be, because he's learning the classics. He's studying Latin. He's studying, Greek, and he's studying French, and he's philosophy. The kid is learning all different things that used to be the way we were educated in this country. And now we have shifted to much more of a vocational education, checking the boxes rather than looking at holistically developing the individual. And all you gotta do is look around at society today and realize how we have really fallen short when it comes to education. And so, maybe if I could go back in time, I would find the point in time where that mentality shifted in education and, throw a few size 12s at some people's rear ends to change their mindset. But, I value the education that I've had, because it has been, even though I got a geology degree in undergrad and then, master's and PhD in exercise physiology, it has been much more broad in terms of its understanding and its depth and everything. And, I wouldn't be sitting here talking about the SPIES model had I had a much more vocational type of training. The Tragedy of the Commons is one of my most revered lessons that I learned in college. And so all of that comes not from being taught to regurgitate information, but being taught to desire information, to absorb information, and to apply that information in every aspect of my life.
I would agree. The only thing that advice I would give to either a younger version of myself or, our listeners who are listening is just don't stop learning. And it's okay to ask the question why. Why are things this way? If you look at past generations, years and years and years ago, they had that question of why are things happening this way? Why does this work? Why does this work? Why is this happening? And through those whys, they figured out a how. They figured out a what, they figured out where, and they figured out when. And so don't ask why, or don't stop asking why is what I should say, and don't stop learning, don't stop growing, keep moving forward. That would be in all aspects, in all intellectual parts. And then the other thing is don't put yourself in a box is what that would be something that I would give myself. I wouldn't, if I could go back and tell myself anything, I would just say, don't say you can't do something. You may struggle in this moment with it, but that doesn't mean you're not going to learn it. You just got to keep at it. You may have a weakness in an area, but just polish up your skill set, polish up, just keep at it, keep practicing, and just improve and get better in any aspects of the intelligence. If it's anything that you have the smallest amount of interest in, just keep learning it, keep going for it. That would be my advice. But 90% of everything else that you're saying, dude, I could not agree more with you on that. You summarized that flawlessly. Thank you.
I would add the question, why not, too? Because too often we don't ask the why not question. We just maybe ask why, but we don't say why not. I mean, we wouldn't have landed on the moon, or, we wouldn't have some of these advanced technologies if somebody hadn't said why not. Why can't I fly? How many people told Da Vinci and all those people back in the day, well, you can't fly. Why not?
Why not? That's good. Moving on. Environmental. Now, I'm really interested on your take on this. Personally, I don't think I have enough skin in the game to discuss the subject of environmental, especially when it comes to you and your life experience, because you've literally moved your environment from the East Coast and the Midwest to the South, and now you've landed here in the Pacific Northwest. And I guess my question is, how important is it to be in one's environment as an individual is attempting to age well? And throughout your life experience, what are some things that you can say, or little nuggets of knowledge that you can pass on to our listeners who probably need to hear that they need to change in their own environment if they're wanting to get out of their current one, but they're wanting to still age well? Does that make sense?
Not entirely. I mean, what are you referring to as environment?
Before we continue, I want to take a brief moment to highlight an affiliate brand that supports the work we do here. As always, this podcast isn't sponsored. Affiliate partnerships simply help us keep producing meaningful conversations around aging well. One product line I've personally vetted and believe in is Primadine from Oxford HealthSpan. Their commitment to purity, scientific rigor, and thoughtful formulation stands out, and I use their products as part of my own wellness practice. If you want to support the podcast while exploring Primadine for yourself, you can find the link in the show notes.
Our environments, as we've mentioned in the physical, right? We talked about epigenetics and how our environment can also help change and shape us, but sometimes it can hinder us, right? And so, is it more important to stay in a current environment, or is it important to go out and spread your wings, I guess, and change your environment? Like, do you stick in something or do you move out of it?
I guess I'm not entirely understanding what you mean by environment, but let me go from this perspective that, when you're talking about maybe your circumstances and, maybe whether it's a job environment or living conditions, living circumstances, relational circumstances or environment, from that perspective, you have really, I think it's 3 things that you can do. You can suffer through that environment, you can leave that environment, or you can change that environment. And so those are the only 3 choices that we have in the circumstances that we're in. And so, if you don't like your work situation, well, you can change jobs, or you can, just suffer through it and be miserable, or you can do something to change it. You can, we look at our political environment in today's age. We just had a conversation with my son Christmas Eve. He was talking about just the failures of our democratic republic in the United States and how, little value there is in voting. And we just went back and forth. If you don't like the situation you're in, then what are you doing to change it? You can run for office. Not voting is not going to fix anything. We have such a dismal pool of potential candidates. I don't care what party you're in. There are very few leaders in this country anymore. So what's the point in voting for somebody who, is not the other person, is basically how Americans have voted for the last several elections. That's not going to fix anything. That's just going to make things worse, maybe not as bad as it would have been theoretically, depending on your point of view, if the other person had gotten into office. But you're not changing anything if you don't act accordingly. And so that would be my answer to as I'm perceiving the environmental question, because, you can take environment as well. You're looking at pollution, looking at, air quality, sound quality. I mean, there's so many different aspects of environment which is one of the reasons why I don't really include environment in the SPIES model. Is some will, when they look at wellness, environment is one of the dimensions of wellness. I consider it to transverse all of the different dimensions of the SPIES model. And so, relational, physical environment, your learning environment, all those types of things are things that we have control over, whether we believe we do or we don't. A lot of people will tend to, and I think it's one of the things that keeps us from aging well, is that we tend to take a much more, external locus of control, where we believe that everything that happens to us and that we have no opportunity to change our environment or our circumstances. And I'm complete opposite. I believe that we have every opportunity to change our circumstances and our environment. And I also think that from an environmental standpoint, we have to accept that everything that, again, we've done in the past, this is, again, going back to why I don't want to answer a question of how I would change things in the past or what advice I would give to myself, is that if I go back and change those things, I am changing the present. And yes, I've lived all over the country, not all over the country, but I've lived in numerous places. Raised in Pittsburgh, so I consider myself a Pittsburgher, although now I've probably spent much more time in my life outside of the city of Pittsburgh. Lived in New York. I've lived in Texas. I did my PhD at Toledo, lived in, both sides of the state of Michigan before coming out here to Oregon. There's a lot of things that I still don't like about living in Oregon right now that I've come to kind of accept and see the importance of being here and why I'm here. And so I just kind of take whatever the environment is offering me as a learning opportunity and a growth opportunity. And if growth is not possible, if harm, and again, harm can be broadly defined. If harm is coming from that, then I need to get out of that environment. But first priority is to change the environment for the better. And oftentimes we are put into an environment for the purpose of changing that environment. If we don't like circumstances, it behooves us to do something to improve it. And that's where society grows. Right. That's where we grow. That's where we age well. Did that answer your question?
It seems to me the advice you're giving is, it definitely does. And it seems to me that the advice that you're giving is just because something is hard, you should get out of it, but you don't have to get out of it right away. You should put forth your best effort to make that scenario better before just throwing in the towel and say, "Oh, this is tough. I gotta get out of it." You should put forth your best effort in order to change that environment around you in a positive way, or critically ask yourself, okay, this situation that I'm in sucks, but what's the life lesson here? What can I learn? How can I grow? How can I make this situation that sucks better? Or do I need to bounce out of it? Because it's starting to affect me physically, mentally, and emotionally, and I don't know if there's a way for me to grow. And so if there's no way for me to grow, now it's time for me to go. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Sort of. I don't think I want to say that things shouldn't be hard. I think we need to embrace the hard. I think too much of our society has shifted away from thinking things should be hard. We have become much more entitled. We've become much more softened by generations that have been raised by more of those tiger moms, helicopter moms, and dads. I shouldn't be sexist there, but we've been raised by parents that have eased our burdens rather than allowing us to struggle through the hard. And it's just like in exercise, you have to know the difference between what is overload and what is overtraining. And as I teach my students in exercise physiology, I'm not one that believes that there is overtraining. I believe that there is just mismanagement of the training stimulus. And so the same thing comes into the hard in life, that there is going to be times when shit is piled on us. And, I think in those situations, the person who comes out the best is like the little girl who, goes into the room and there's this big pile of horse manure, and she gets all excited and starts digging through it. And everybody's, why are you so excited being given this pile of horse manure? And she said, well, I know it's a pile of horse manure, which means that there's got to be a horse in here somewhere. And that is the approach that we need to be taking when things get hard is, okay, what's the growth opportunity in this? What is the lesson to be learned? And if there's harm coming from the circumstance, then that's when you get out. But until then, it's like, how am I growing from this experience? And how can I change the situation if it is kind of on the wrong side of good growth? That makes sense.
Right.
And then, the third option ultimately is then to get out of it.
That's good. Wow, that's good. Hope our listeners are absorbing that. That was really good.
You skipped over emotional.
E is emotional. That is what, okay. What advice would you give our listeners emotionally that they need to know to age well?
I'm probably the last person to give emotional advice. Just ask my family my flaws and my faults in that area. I think probably the best advice that we could give ourselves to age well and the in emotional area is grace. Grace toward others, but grace toward ourselves as well. I think oftentimes we don't give ourselves grace. And so recognizing that we are flawed human beings and we are going to make mistakes, but not accept the fact that we are flawed individuals. That there needs to be change that comes. So when we recognize where we are falling short in our lives and in our emotional well-being, I struggle on a daily basis with roundabouts in the state of Oregon because people in this state cannot drive, and this is probably most states. For some reason, we're building more and more roundabouts, but people can't seem to learn how to drive in them. And that's only one of the many things that gets me worked up as I'm driving in my commute. And so I'm learning that I have to kind of let go of things. And one of my little mantras, and I carry a little water bottle in my car to kind of try and have the habit of spraying. If I'm getting upset about something, I just spray it and say Haval. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that entirely correctly. I've talked with Lauren Axelrod about it a little bit on the other podcast, but Haval is the word that is translated as nothingness in Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And it's just like, that everything is really just mist. It's nothing. It's almost kind of non-sequential, that you just got to let go of things and let it just float away as a mist. And that to me is one of the most important things I keep trying to drive into my own head, to just kind of let go of things. We can look at it just kind of letting go of things, riding the wave, and just trying to realize that, okay, we're going through something right now, but it's not really that important in the bigger scheme of things. And just, if somebody cuts you off on the highway, is it really that important? Or if somebody cuts in line at the grocery store, is it really that important? Does my kid not take out the trash? Is that important? It's really, the most important thing is, how are we reacting to people? How are we working to boost other people's emotions? I think one of the greatest lessons I learned on this podcast was from Rob Kelly, when he talked about how he could change somebody's life with just 2 words, and talking about, just seeing somebody and saying, nice sneakers. And that person is going to walk away looking at their shoes thinking, yeah, they are kind of nice sneakers. I like these. And they have a much more uplifted mindset, and they're going to go on and they're going to treat their coworkers, their partners, and others differently because we've elevated their emotional state. And so, I've struggled a lot with, my mantra is I am third. My God is first, my family and friends are second, and I am third. But I have a habit of getting very selfish within that. And I've really been exploring this idea of self versus selfless, and how do you balance that? And, because, we can be overly selfish where we're thinking only of ourselves, which is not I am third, that is I am first. But you can get into the I am third mentality where you become totally submissive or subservient, or, getting walked all over by people because you feel like, well, I have to be third. I have to be, subservient to these individuals. But the reality is that we need to kind of approach it from a more transcendent self point of view, where we are becoming better individuals to help other people become better individuals, and kind of stepping into what I learned recently in terms of, I've talked about the tragedy of the commons, where it's take, and that destroys everything. And, we had in a recent episode with Tim Christofferson pointed out to me, the possibility of the glory of the commons. And that's how we have to kind of approach really all of the well-centered fitness model. But emotional in particular, we also have to look at, where are we creating a greater good in this opportunity rather than just simply taking, because by giving and taking, we benefit everybody. And so that's kind of, I guess, the advice I would say with the emotional piece is, don't take things too hard, don't take offense, have grace for others, but more importantly, have grace for yourself.
For me, as far as emotional goes, I agree with you. I think we need to have grace for others. I think we need to have grace for ourselves. I think we need to have grace for the situation that we're placed in. I also believe that love is one of the most powerful things there is on this earth. I believe that love is, and I always have. There's different types of love. There's that brotherly love. There's that motherly love, where a mother will protect their child, will do anything. That mama bear approach. There's friendship. There's camaraderie. There's spouse love. There's just all these different types of love. And if we can give that same love and respect to others, and it spreads like wildfire. With that also being said, hate can also go that same route. So if you're going to choose between love and hate, I would strongly recommend love, and that also ties in with that grace, and it allows you to not be so angry at certain situations if you have grace. My third little advice is something that kind of learned from you. I love it. I use it all the time. The attitude of gratitude. It is so catchy, but man, you just say it at work, and other people are like, "Hey, you're right. We gotta have an attitude of gratitude," and people just catch on really fast, and it's so cool. And lastly, something that I've learned, and I can't remember if I learned it from listening to our guests, or if I've just learned it recently within the last few years, but something that I've learned as far as emotional growth goes is understanding the difference between empathy and sympathy. And if you can understand the two of those, and you can be a little bit less, and I know it sounds weird, less sympathetic, but more empathetic, it kind of ties in with everything else that we're talking about. It ties in with that love. It ties in with that grace. It allows you to put yourself in someone else's shoes and just, I don't know, get that deeper connection with people, to not just allow them to grow emotionally, but you yourself will grow emotionally as well. And it's really cool. Those would be the things that I've learned, especially as we've started this podcast. Okay, now we're ready for the last one, which is social. Now, as far as what I would tell my younger self or anything like that, my younger self always knew the importance of having a social circle. I just could never articulate it in a way. But after having the amazing guests that we've had on this podcast and hearing their perspective, there's no denying that it is critical to have social interactions, especially if one is trying to age well. I mean, there's no denying that we as humans, we need it. Even if you're the most stereotypical introvert, and you're like, I don't want I don't want to be around people. It's important to have social interactions. So I guess my question is, Dr. Armstrong, what advice would you give to those that are willing to listen right now on the importance of social interactions?
I think, we're increasingly seeing the scientific backing for how important social connection is for our health, our wellness, our longevity. And, we have to find ways to have productive, purposeful social connection. And we have to engage with other people too to make sure that they are getting that level of social connection. It's not so much about ourselves as much as being more other-centered in terms of interacting with people. And we had a guest on recently talking about food insecurity in our senior population. And, there are things that I had not even thought about that came up in that conversation, such as, you'll have people who will avoid social connection because they can't afford to do it. They can't afford, to get invited out for a cup of coffee or to go to a movie or something like that. They can't afford it. They're going to avoid it. And that's robbing that person of that opportunity. And so oftentimes we have to look at ways that we can engage individuals in social connection that is not going to, cause them distress or cause them, to avoid interacting because they can't afford it. You think of potlucks at church or whatever organization, group, neighborhood potlucks. People might avoid it because they can't afford to feed themselves, let alone to bring, a meal for, an entire group. And so we have to take a very careful look at how are we creating an environment for social connections in our communities. And we've talked about bringing back the front porch, something I think is dramatically missing in our communities. That was something that is free social interaction. When you're sitting out on your front porch and your neighbors walk by and you're able to say, hi, how you doing? How are the kids? And having that conversation is something that doesn't cost. And we can see when our neighbors might be struggling a little bit more when we are interacting with them. And we have moved in modern suburbia to having back porches, fenced in yards, and everything that excludes our neighbors rather than includes them. And so bringing back the front porch, bringing back community parks, doing events to where, maybe we recognize that, the people who are going to have the greater difficulty in kind of participating are enabled to participate more effectively. So, you look at, a potluck gathering. Maybe your seniors don't have to bring anything. You say, we don't want you to bring anything. These are the individuals that are going to provide. Younger people likewise, because sometimes your youngest people, your singles and, a church group or something like that might be struggling just with new jobs or whatever it might be and not having money. And so just kind of recognizing who is able and who is not and engaging with those people who are the most in need of having that social connection. And I think we could do a lot to promote better longevity by building communities that connect all generations together, whether it's, having, seniors coming into elementary schools and reading to the kids, or coming for lunch, and being able to then provide a lunch for seniors for free because they come to the school and, they're not feeling like it's a handout to them. It's an opportunity for them to give to the kids to benefit from having the older, wiser adults around, but then also the grandparents and the older adults are getting a healthy meal that they might not otherwise get. So we have to look at ways that we can bring people together. Universities should be offering free classes to our oldest of the population and bringing them in to have a little bit greater social connection with our college students, because the college students can benefit, the older adult benefits. and recognizing, when we have the sandwich generations, those individuals who are struggling to be able to care for their young kids as well as their aging parents, how can we as neighbors, be good neighbors and help these individuals out? So a lot of the need for social connections is getting back to the whole idea of love your neighbor. It's like as simple as that.
Right. That was wow. And honestly, I've been in that predicament before where it's like I can't go or I can't participate, and but still, even after being in that for a good chunk of my life, actually, there's I don't know. It's something you don't even think about. Because now that I'm not in that, if someone else is struggling, I try to give them the opportunity. Hey, don't worry about it, man. I got you. Don't worry. Like we'll take care of you. And just to have everyone interact. But you're absolutely right. I think that's really that's amazing advice to give, because a lot of people they don't even think, they don't even comprehend. Like me, I don't even comprehend that. And I've lived through that where someone's like, I'm not going to show up because of the embarrassment of not being able to afford or not being able to participate or not being able to. And it's just what a humbling conversation this has been. And I really appreciate that perspective, because what a good reminder. I completely forgot about that. And knowing the importance of social interaction, I'm going to be way more aware of that, and hopefully give people an opportunity to not miss out on social interactions that we're either going to be attending or hosting. So thank you, Dr. Armstrong, on that.
Well, I would add as well, individuals with disabilities and, limitations, even, physical characteristics that might be somewhat off-putting to people. We have to recognize that these are people too. And in many cases, we tend to underestimate the intellect of some individuals because of their physical appearance. And I think we're better off going into a situation overestimating somebody's intellect or their, social abilities rather than underestimating. Because when we don't isolate somebody by overestimating their ability to interact with us, we can always temper it down a little bit. But when you go up to an older adult and talk to them like they're a child, or talk to somebody who's in a wheelchair like a child, or somebody with cerebral palsy, and they have difficulty maybe communicating, that doesn't mean that they are not even more intellectual than you are. And so don't go into a situation assuming that somebody is something that they may not be. And so go in with the idea of trying to include everybody in the situation, to be more inclusive.
Yeah, that's good. Wow. I mean, I feel like we could keep talking, but we're kind of running out of time on this podcast episode. I just want to say this has been one heck of a journey with you. And I'm so happy that you asked me to be a part of this podcast and this movement. And I feel really blessed. And I know that I've learned a lot, especially with our amazing guests that we've had. I've watched you grow. I'm hoping you've seen me grow on this. And I just want to have this before we wrap everything up. Is there anything else that you would like to add, or perhaps clarify information on our spies? Maybe something that wasn't covered, but needs to be covered. That little last bit of nugget before you wrap us off and in today's episode.
I think the only thing really to add is that as we look at aging, let's not succumb to the longevity model of aging well. Let's look at the more, and even beyond health span, looking toward more well span. And, we have a guest coming up that will be talking about her book, Joy Span, and looking at aging as being transformational as opposed to transactional. And how are we giving back to society as we age? How can society better transform the aging process for other individuals so that we're not being reactive in terms of, having to be treated for sickness or, being treated for loneliness and whatever, across the SPIES model, that the whole intent of interjecting the SPIES model or well-centered fitness into the Aging Well podcast is to help drive home the understanding that aging is something we're all doing and we do it better together, and that we have to take an active role in our aging process and in the aging process of other individuals. And so it's all about community. It's all about, recognizing that spiritual well-centeredness is knowing that there is something greater than self, whatever that might be in our growth, where we are in our spiritual evolution. From a physical standpoint, that everybody is different, everybody has different capacities, that there is no set model for physical wellness. It's what can we do at this moment to be our best, to be better tomorrow. And if something is getting in the way, then we have to ask, what's the why not? And use that to propel us to doing the type of activity that we can best benefit from and is going to help us to age well. And then intellectually, just constantly wanting to learn and understand that knowledge is power. And the more that we learn, the more that we grow. Emotionally, just give ourselves grace, give others grace, try and treat others as we would want to be treated. And that leads into the to the social piece, where all of these, the spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, all leads into a better understanding of the social and how important it is to us spiritually, physiologically, intellectually, and emotionally to be included and to include others so that we build community and, age together as one.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Armstrong.
All right. Well, I hope our listeners benefited from this. Remember, you're not going to change your past, but you have the opportunity to change the moment. And what we do right now is the most important thing that we can do to age well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.